All right, I got recording going. All right, everybody, welcome to our midday webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We got Curtis here. So I'm Jason Buckley, and we got Curtis Twellman. He's going to run through this quick PowerPoint to quickly show you all some key features of different tracks you may find here in the Midwest and help you identify them as you're out in the woods.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So, yeah, Jason set it up. We're going to be talking about mammals today, and really we're going to be talking about the mid-sized mammals that really interesting nocturnal critters that are all around us, but we don't get an opportunity to see all the time. So, with that, we'll jump right into it. All right, get the videos off the screen so we can focus on the cool stuff. Well, this isn't cool depending on who you are, but basically our landscape in Illinois has changed a lot since Columbian settlement. So basically you see the picture there in the left is what it looked like in the early 1800s. And then fast forward to today, basically we are comprised almost entirely of agriculture through most of Illinois today. Of course, we have the giant metropolitan area of the Chicago metro area that you see up there right against Lake Michigan. So the landscape has changed, and this change has affected animals in different ways. Some animals, this change has been a detriment, and they no longer reside here, and some animals may be more abundant today than at any point in their history. So this next slide here gives you a idea of what I'm talking about. We actually have a really high population of mammals right in some of our big cities. And this is what I would call an unhealthy congregation of raccoons around some kind of food source, but this is actually what happens in some of our suburban areas. If there's good forest, good den trees for them to have a suitable place to stay, or a nice sewer system they can get into, and food, and then a lack of larger predators, we can get some really heightened numbers of some of these mammals. So while that can be a good thing and a bad thing, as far as somebody who just wants to go outside and find tracks to ID and learn about animals that are active at night by finding the sign they leave during the day, this can be a real opportunity. So it's not all bad. So, we're talking about mammals here today. Now, is that the only creature out there leaving tracks on the landscape? Absolutely not. You can find tracks, even insects will leave tracks given the right time of year. So, here in this presentation, we're going to be focused on the mammals, so that very far left-hand side of all the different classes that we have. And then this poster is kind of shows you all the different classes of mammals and how diverse this group is. And of course, it includes us. So this should be a class of creatures that's near and dear to all of our hearts. We don't have all these critters in Illinois, of course, the egg-laying mammals up there. We got none of those, but we do have one marsupial. We got the possum, which we'll talk about here today. So really diverse, going all the way up to the beaver, the largest rodent we have here in North America, second largest rodent in the world. Um, Really cool. But in general, these animals are very secretive, especially in terms of you think about coyotes, fox, bobcats. Those critters are animals that really have statewide distribution and healthy populations, but how often do you get to see them in the wild? My guess is not very often, but if you look to the ground, you can find some clues they leave behind. And we can't cover all the mammals. We're going to be basically going the mesofauna, weasels to deer here today. We're going to leave out a lot of the small rodents and stuff just because for time we'd be here all day. So we'll stick to the mid-sized stuff. But when you're identifying a track, the main thing you got to remember, it's not very often that you're going to find the beautiful picture that you see in your field guide. It's the natural landscape. Things happen. So you need to find as many tracks as you can, find the best tracks you can, and put together clues to try to make the best identification you can. But remember that it's part art and part science, and it seldom works out where it's really clear, really obvious. You know, that's the exception rather than the rule. Sometimes a positive ID is just not possible to come by. You can get a really good guess. And sometimes a positive ID is clear. This here in the picture, this is a coyote for a lot of different reasons we'll talk about here as we go along. But what I'm looking for when I first encounter a track, look at the size, look at the shape, but also notice the pattern. How are the tracks laid out? What was this animal doing? Don't forget to pay attention to what habitat you're in and what season it is. There's certain critters that are active at certain times a year and not in others, which can help with your identification. Look where it's going, where it's coming from, and then obviously look for any other sign nearby. Is there a scat? Is there a din? Is there something else that this animal's done that can help you narrow down this ID? Because as you're about to see in this presentation, we got a lot of mid-size animals out here, and we're not even covering all the domestic. So the amount, size, shapes of animals that can be out there in the Illinois landscape is incredibly diverse. First thing I want to do is count the toes. Now, got to lay out the caveat that not all these tracks you're going to find in Illinois. If you find a moose track out there, definitely let me know, because that shouldn't be there. That's probably something just sometimes tracks will do weird things in the soft mud or snow that melts. Something that's a very normal deer track out in the sun, a snowy track for a day. You come in the next day and you might swear it is a moose track. So remember that the substrate, the landscape out there can do some funny things. But first thing we're doing, counting the toes. In general, if it's got two, we're talking hooves, that's going to be our cervid, our deer. I guess if it's one, you'd be thinking odd-toed ungulates. That's probably a horse. That's a domestic, because we don't have any tapirs or rhinos or zebras. So one is also possible, as is three for mammals. But in general, in Illinois, if you see three, it's probably going to be a herptile, some kind of salamander, lizard, or a bird. A lot of times birds will show four too. But now when we get down into the 4 and 5 toes, this is the bread and butter of where we're going to be sitting at with most of these mammals. When you count 4 toes, most of the time in Illinois, it's going to be either feline or canine. Now rabbits will also show 4 toes, but you can't normally make out the toes on a rabbit track. And a lot of rodents will show maybe 4 toes on the front, 5 on the back. But again, they're small enough that it is hard to pick out the toes. So when you count 4, usually we're thinking feline, canine, and then 5 is going to be most other mammals that we're talking about here. So if we jump further into the feline canine realm in this next slide here, the first thing we got to ask ourselves is it wild or domestic? Because domestics are everywhere in Illinois. I don't care how far back you think you're away from houses. There are domestic cats and dogs that roam that, I promise you. Now, if you get way up in northern Alaska, maybe there you can try to claim that area alone will basically say that it's wild and not domestic, but in Illinois we can't claim that. So always try to rule out domestic first. And one of the main things that I'm looking at, because domestic tracks are so variable, is just what is the animal doing? Meandering versus direct travel. So especially in the snow, when times are hard, most wild animals are very point A to point B. It's survival. They're trying to conserve as much energy as possible. You will find tracks that are laid out like this bottom picture that look just like a straight line of dots as far as you can see. Most of the time, that's going to indicate a wild animal, because that's an animal moving A to B and not messing around. Whereas if you see this top picture, that's dogs that are well fed, that live a life of luxury, that know they're going back to a heated fireplace and belly rubs. They're running all over the place. So if you see that, not to say that wild animals do not recreate, but in general, when conditions are tough, when you have snow on the ground, if you see animals running all around rompus room like that in that top picture, that's going to be a domestic, a well-fed domestic. So keep that in mind, and they absolutely can be anywhere, highly variable. Now, in this next slide, we're going to get down into the cat versus dog. So we got 4 toes here. We got 4 toes. We know it's one of the two. Let's say we ruled out domestic. We ruled out domestic as much as possible. We're looking at cat versus dogs here. The obvious thing is claw marks. When it comes to our cats, and that's whether it's a house cat, a bobcat, or a mountain lion, or even a lynx, which we don't get here in Illinois, but just a state to the north of us, Wisconsin, they do get a lynx that pass through maybe once every 6 to 7 years, so not too far away. All these animals have retractable claws, which means that 99% of the time when they're walking around, these claws are withdrawn. You're not going to see them in the track. Now, I said 99% of the time, cats will push their claws out in soft mud, soft earth to gain more traction. So it is possible to see them, but personally, I've never seen a claw mark in a cat track. That's always a good one, but it's not the only one, because as tracks age and degrade, those claw marks can become really hard to see. So don't use that as your only thing you look for. Look at the shape of the pad. On cats, you've got 2 bumps on the front of the pad, 3 on the back. And again, this is across all cats. And on dogs, you have 1 bump on the front, 2 bumps on the back. Now, on domestic dogs, that bump on the front of the heel pad, it can be pretty wide, but it is just 1 bump with a single peak. On cats, that leading edge of the pad is going to have 2 identifiable peaks most of the time. If the substrate's soft, really moving around, you may not see that real well, but then look at the toes. Cats always have a leading toe. And that means that there's 1 toe that's a little bit further ahead of the other one that's right beside it. They're not 100% symmetrical. The dog tracks being almost 100% symmetrical, you can lay out that X, like I've got that blue X placed in the coyote track up in the top left there. You can make that nice X and it doesn't touch the pad, doesn't touch the toes. You can't do that in the cat track. It's not symmetrical, leading toe. If you add all these things together, it's pretty easy to determine whether you're dealing with a cat or a dog, but never just use one of these. Try to add on 2 or 3. And one caveat about cats, they love to step in places where they don't leave tracks. So finding bobcat tracks can sometimes be difficult if we don't have a good snow on. Those tracks up there in nice mud, that's definitely the exception. I feel like bobcats go out of their way to step in grassy areas or whatever to not leave tracks. But if you look hard enough, you'll find them. And if we get those nice dusting of snow, that's where all secrets are off, and that's the great time to get outside and look around and see what's there. But now from here, tracks are gonna get a little easier once we get away from dogs and cats. But here's just an impression of what a dog track looks like next to a coyote. Now the coyote tracks are a little they were placed in wetter snow, so you see them actually get down into the puddle. But look at that egg shape. Coyote tracks, unless if they're at a dead run, they can be splayed out a little bit, but they're almost always pointed inward into an egg shape that has almost a point the way that they're facing. Whereas dog tracks are going to be spread out, they're going to be more circular, and the toes are going to be splayed out. They're never going to be just real tight in like the coyote track there to the right. And that's a deer in the middle that's older and messed up. So we can notice that X that I mentioned before. As these tracks degrade, that's the last thing that stays there, is that protrusion of dirt right in the center that you see in that track. It makes an X. So even after most of the identifiable parts of that track have degraded away, if you look and see what looks like a whole bunch of X's in the middle of the track, that's some kind of dog. You might be able to use other clues to tell what it is, but coyotes always a really direct path of travel. This is the common trot gait that's there in the left picture by my boot there. So Anywhere from like 12 to 16 inches between tracks is what you'll typically see. Pretty variable, but again, direct travel. Yes, they will investigate things, but more or less they're um, if you can look at those tracks over a long enough area, you'll see that they're going straight to something, some area of interest. Now we get into the foxes. So it can be really tough to distinguish red fox from gray fox. This is a real good diagram I found here and put in it that kind of shows the structure of the foot. And in general, when you're looking at fox tracks, they can overlap with dog tracks a ton. So look for that indications of a wild animal, real direct path of travel. Red fox have a ton of fur on their feet. So if you see tracks, and these tracks here are on a pond, so this is ice underneath a little bit of snow, these are really good tracks, but they look a little bit messed up. And that's very common with red fox because they basically got little brushes on their feet. So they almost kind of wipe away their track as they go, which is pretty cool. And the gray fox, which size-wise is not a whole lot different, they are a little bit wider than they are than red fox tracks are. They have a little less fur on them. But the big thing that people usually can pick out about gray foxes is the pad, the side of the pad. And you can pick it out in that drawing. If the sides of the pad ever show on the trailing edge, that's almost always a gray fox, because the pad of a red fox will either look like a little oval or a chevron, and that's it. It'll never have those protrusions that kind of the gray fox has on the trailing edge of the pad. So you may see those. You may also just watch where the fox goes. Gray fox have semi-retractable claws. They can actually climb trees, and they will climb up there and eat, whether it's to go after an animal or to get at fruit. Foxes are omnivores. They'll climb up there and eat apples or whatever it might be. So if you see them doing any activity like that, that can be a good clue that it's a gray fox as opposed to a red. Red's definitely more common. Now your bobcat, again, tracks, they're not always in the perfect spot to find them. This track on the right is a good example of that. If you see this track, you have enough clues there to tell you that it's a bobcat, but is it quite as pretty as the track on the left? Probably not. So sometimes you gotta add things together, but look how you cannot create an X there without going through the pad and the toes. It just doesn't work. The track is not 100% symmetrical. There's a leading toe. If I look at the pad, I see two, even in this one that's messed up, I see two bumps on the front of that pad, and I see what looks like three on the back. So cat all day, add that up with no appearance of claw marks on there. And then the next thing we need to do to decide what cat it is look at size. Because really the only difference between house cat, bobcat, and mountain lion track is the primary difference is size. And here on this next slide, we'll talk about it. But the nice thing is we all kind of have a little measure. Most of us have a measuring thing attached to our hand. If you pull out your pinky, check it against a ruler. But for most people, each section of your pinky is right around an inch. And so if you lay your pinky across a track and it's right about an inch wide, you're dealing with a house cat, probably. If it's right around 2 inches wide, you're probably dealing with a bobcat. And then if it gets to about that 3 inches wide part, so your whole pinky is taking up the width of that track, now you're thinking mountain lion. So definitely use that for scale. And when taking pictures of tracks, always take a picture of something with scale. Because if you look at these house cat tracks to the left, I could zoom in on those and I could tell you that they're 4 inches across and that was a lion track, and you wouldn't have anything to refute me with. So without something for scale, a lot of times track pictures are not nearly as useful as you think. You may be able to get it down to feel a day, but you may not be able to get it much better than that. And then we don't have lynx here, but just I will mention they have giant snowshoe feet. So actually lynx tracks can be bigger than a mountain lion track, but they get that same action as red fox where they're covered in fur, and so they almost kind of erase the details of their tracks while they walk. Pretty cool. All right, now let's get into some easier tracks. All right, look how distinctive these are, raccoon tracks. And this is the typical way you'll see raccoons. And this changes by the way they move. But raccoons are one animal that walks around out there like us. They're plantigrade. So they actually walk on flat feet as opposed to all these animals we've been talking about before, digigrade. They run on their toes. So now look at that. These tracks don't look that dissimilar from ours other than size. I mean, if you put your hand together and slap it in the mud, it doesn't look dissimilar from a raccoon footprint. But notice how the front and the back feet are different. Now, that is not always super obvious. If the substrate is hard, you won't get that whole back foot, the whole length of that back foot. So sometimes the front and the back feet will kind of look the same, more like they do in this harder sand here to the right. But seeing tracks paired like that, very typical for the common gait of raccoons. Not the way they're always going to be. They definitely can walk, and they would have a gait more similar to the coyotes and fox that we saw before, with much shorter distance between tracks and a little bit squattier because their legs are further together or further apart on their body. But the main way I always tell raccoons, if you see the 5 fingers, 5 toes, and their long fingers and toes, and they're all pointing forward, usually that's a raccoon. And this becomes good when we get here to the next animal on our list, which is we mentioned them before. This is our lone representative of the marsupials here in North America, the opossum. These tracks are somewhat similar to raccoons. They can be found in the same spot. They're usually paired. The direction of travel is usually a little bit more ambling than raccoons. They're a little bit smaller, so they're going to be closer together. But remember how the raccoon, it looked like your hand when all the fingers are pointed straight out. Now, a opossum, or you can call them possum, is more like your hand when you spread it out, full spread. So if you spread your hand full out and slap it down into the mud, you're going to get a track pretty similar to the front track of a possum. And then their back foot is really distinctive with that helix, that little thumb that comes out. That's their opposable thumb. They can grab sticks and leaves and stuff and bring that back to their nest to make it all cozy. Really distinctive. Not always super clear, but even if you just see that front hand, if you see a splayed out human hand, little human hand, it's a possum. If you see one that's tight together, it's a raccoon. Now, skunk. Here, we're getting into one with the last two also, but now we really want to consider seasonality. So when it's really, really cold, raccoons, possums don't move nearly as much, but they do a little bit. Skunks are even more so. This is a fossorial animal, so they live underground, so they will spend prolonged periods underground when the weather gets really bad. So if we're in a polar vortex and you see tracks outside and you're thinking they're skunk, maybe you want to reconsider. Anything's possible with animals, but definitely consider the time of year. Now, skunk tracks can look fairly similar to raccoon tracks. They are forward pointing, but one thing that usually will make them stand out is just look at how long the claws are. If you see a claw mark that's continuously showing up that far in front of the track, that's not a raccoon. That's a skunk. And then if you can see their back foot's almost like a small bear print, or similar to, I guess, a little human print. So that's a little bit more distinctive if you get a soft enough substrate to see that. But also follow the tracks, and usually you'll find digging or a den not far away that can also help you identify what it is. Striped skunks are really notorious for when they're hunting grubs and other invertebrates like that, they'll dig a series of conical holes. So if you follow these tracks onto your nice green sod lawn and you find a whole bunch of small conical holes, That's a skunk, 100%. You don't even have to smell it. Oh, here's our buddy, the old woodchuck, the groundhog, or the whistle pig. Three different names for the same little fuzzy critter. This is another one you're not going to find in the depths of winter. You're not going to find their tracks most of the time. The tracks are pretty similar to raccoon and skunk, so they can definitely be tough to distinguish. But that's when you gotta just add up all the clues. Take the size, look at the size, look at the front and the back foot. The back foot of the woodchuck is a different shape, different size than the back foot of the skunk. So while their front feet may look pretty dang similar and even similar to raccoons, the back feet, if you can find that track, is going to be your best way to tell, is it a woodchuck or is it a skunk or is it a raccoon? And again, these critters don't travel too far from their dens. So if you follow this far enough, you should see a series of dens that's going to let you know it's a woodchuck. All right, now our last fossorial mammal here, the badger. This is a really cool critter. This is the one that moves a lot of dirt. Not only do they live underground, but they also hunt fossorially. So they will dig out other ground-dwelling mammals and eat them. Pretty hardcore. But now we're dealing with a little bit larger track, and I one thing you always notice about the badger tracks is the big claws, and the tracks are always pointed inward to the animal. So it's almost like they got, imagine them like alligator legs, that kind of come out real squatty, but then point in. So when you see those tracks that point in, they're definitely a lot larger than a woodchuck track or even a skunk track. And then you get those really long claw marks, probably dealing with a badger. And if you follow those tracks long enough, you're probably going to find a den entrance about the size of a basketball. Don't stick your head in there. Badgers are not known to be friendly. Rabbits and squirrels. So I mentioned these are other critters that can show the four toes too, but usually you're not seeing the toes on rabbit and squirrel tracks. It's more the shape, and these are the characteristic shapes. This is in snow. You can also see this in mud. When you see that characteristic rabbit shape, they got the two marks with the two trailing that are more centrally located. So the whole thing kind of makes almost like the number seven. So you just look 7, 7, 7, 7. That's a rabbit. Whereas a squirrel, they all look like little W's, little W's, if you kind of draw it in there, but it's like a little parallelogram. And so if you see parallelogram, parallelogram, parallelogram going tree to tree, you're dealing with a tree squirrel. Now, as far as how to deal fox squirrel and gray squirrel, that's outside of my realm. I haven't figured that one out yet. Now, weasels, these little guys, we don't see tracks from them very often. In general, it's not until we get some good snow until we can even know that they're even around. But we do have weasels out there. Actually, all three are possible, not likely, but least weasel, short-tailed weasel, and long-tailed weasel, all three are outside chance in Illinois. And cool thing, the least weasel, this is the one that doesn't have the black tip on the tail. So the other two will both show a black tip on the tail. The one without the black tip on the tail, least weasel, the smallest vertebrate carnivore in the whole world. So really cool, interesting critters. They tackle animals as big as eastern cottontails, which would be like you going outside and tackling a bison and killing it with your teeth. So definitely deserve a lot of respect. But when we do get that snow on, the best way to find the weasel tracks, look for those two little paired dots where the weasel's jumping around, and then especially a tunnel where it goes under the snow, and then it may be under the snow for a while, investigating some rodent tunnels, and then it's back on top of the snow. When you see that here in Illinois, most of the time you're going to be dealing with a weasel, and definitely follow those tracks because weasel tracks are the funnest tracks out of anything to follow, I think. because weasels do some fun things and go under the snow, climbing trees, and sometimes they're active diurnally. So that's one that if you do find some weasel tracks in the snow and you follow them, you may get to see them out hunting, which is definitely a treat for anybody. Now, on the next slide here, we're getting into our water critters. So now we're next to the water and we're talking beaver. So this is the largest rodent in North America, the second largest rodent in the whole world next to the capybara. But we just saw a picture of a beaver from Wisconsin, 130 pounds. Like, holy cow. That is definitely atypical, but certainly beaver in the 40 to 60 pound range is not atypical at all. So you're dealing with a track that can be as big as your hand or even a little bit bigger. So it's probably going to be one of the largest tracks you see out here. Here's a little video. You can see what me and Jason saw the last time we went to the pond here next to campus. Coming right out of the water. Now, the only thing that you would ever confuse, I guess, with a beaver might be like a swan or goose or something with a big webbed feet. So definitely make sure it's not that, but your beaver track is going to be way bigger and, of course, sink down a lot further than those birds, which are generally going to weigh, 20 pounds or less. And once you get one of the big beavers leaving a track bigger than your hands, that's probably a 50-plus-pound animal. Now, river otter, this is another critter you don't get to see very often, but we have them statewide distribution. They are all over the place. They cover huge home ranges. They can cover 100 square miles. They can cover 60 linear miles of stream. So we're talking animals that move. Sometimes they're hanging out together. One of the great ways I really like to pick out otter tracks, if it looks like a dog track that's going into and out of the water, probably an otter. Now, not always, because some dogs do like to go in and out of the water. So try to look close and see if it's got that fifth toe. Because remember, with otter, we're talking 5 toes, not the 4 that your dogs show. Because that fifth toe is the dew claw way up the arm there. It doesn't show. But also look at the pattern. And this is true of all mustelids, so all weasels. Their typical loping pattern is that picture to the right, where you'll see 4 tracks, space, 4 tracks, space, 4 tracks. And so just a little jagged line for and space, and then every once in a while they'll slide. And this is true for mink, this is true for otter, this is true for all the way down to the least weasels. So across the weasels, look for that kind of track pattern. Look for the 5 toes, and then sometimes, like in the picture there in the middle, you can even kind of see the webbing in between there. So those are really clear tracks, but that's the exception, not the rule. And here's a little video. We can hit play. This is Otter Tracks that Jason and I found on that same pond. So here's the habitat. We're in a little pond located right next to a city. And coming out of the water, boom, here we go. Looks kind of like a dog track, but if you look close, there's that 5th toe. And it's in the pattern, typical weasel pattern. So pretty cool. All right, mink. So this is your smaller otter. This is basically, a very similar critter, just in a miniature size. So look for that same loping pattern of 4 tracks, 4 tracks, 4 tracks, but obviously much smaller. If you look there next to the ruler, the entirety of that track across is an inch or less. So a lot smaller than the otter tracks. Pretty similar to muskrat tracks, but the mink tracks are going to look much more athletic. They look sharper. It looks, for lack of a better term, it looks like a predator, whereas muskrat tracks look more elongated, like a squirrel or a rabbit type track. So really good mink tracks. The 5th toe is not always visible. You can see it here really well, but if you look there to the right, in some of those you can just see the claw marks, which is very typical since mink is a small animal. A lot of times the only thing that registers is the claws and the toes, and sometimes you only see those four. That fifth little guy doesn't register. So even if you see those four and it's in the right pattern, 4 4 4 along a stream bed, you're pretty sure you're dealing with a mink. And here, this next video we have is going to be muskrat tracks and mink tracks together. So we get to the edge of the pond, you'll notice muskrat tracks going perpendicular going into the pond, but if you go right along the pond edge, those are mink tracks going from the left to the right. So running parallel to the edge of the pond. We've got mink tracks overlaid on muskrat tracks, which of course is very common because mink will eat muskrats. That's one of their favorite foods, along with whatever fish and clams and crustaceans and other little critters they can find. So muskrat, just talked about them, pretty similar in size to the mink, going to be in the same area, but look at those elongated toes, right? Really easy to pick out. And even in the snow there to the right, you can even see the drag mark where their little tail hit the snow. So that might be possible and something that you're definitely never going to see in a mink track. And look at the pairing. Two, two, two. This animal is walking very similar to like how a raccoon walks. So it's leaving tracks in a similar way, as opposed to the mink. If you saw those tracks, it would more be a group of four and then a big space and a group of four. So a little bit different way they lay the tracks down out there. Now, tracks aren't the only things that mammals are leaving, and if you're out there and you're following tracks long enough, maybe you get lucky enough and you find a scat, right? That's a good thought. Follow something long enough and maybe you find a pile of poop. That's it's always good to have things to look forward to, right? We're amused by simple things here, but anyway, now this scat in the bottom left, that's going to be typical coyote or fox, depending on size. Coyote and fox scat, very similar. It's going to be filled with mostly hair. There might be some bone fragments. There might be some little deer hooves in there, depending on the time of year. We're getting to be in the spring where they're dropping the fawn, so you will start to see coyote scats with deer hooves winding up in there. But that's what they look like. Cat scat's going to look very similar, but be a little bit more cylindrical and not usually have those points. Still look twisted though, because both dogs and cats, they pass food through their stomachs really, really quick, and it gives them that kind of twisted appearance. But now your raccoon scat looks a lot like bear scat, or this might be similar to what your scat looks like if you've been shopping at Whole Foods a lot. A lot of nuts, a lot of berries. One word of caution. This is a common way that babies and toddlers get raccoon roundworm, because raccoon scat can actually look like a granola bar, and they do carry the raccoon version of roundworm, which is not good. So definitely keep anybody that's susceptible to putting things in their mouths. Watch them very closely around any bodies of water where there's a flat place that a raccoon may use as a toilet. Now, otter toilets, otter latrines, these are cool. Find a bunch of otters signed together. Sometimes you'll find areas where they're making scent mounds, and there'll be these piles even on the mounds. But basically, when they dry out, all that's left is a pile of fish scales and exoskeletons and just the remnants of all the stuff that the otter eat. When otter scat's fresh, it'll actually be formed and be a lot darker, but as it dries, it just kind of turns into a pile of scales and stuff there. And then other than scat, we also, some of these animals make some really big structures that we can find. And so muskrat huts or push-ups, these are little things that muskrats make in the fall. You'll start seeing these pop up. They're always made out of vegetation, and they'll pop up pretty quick. And some of these the muskrats will use for homes. A lot of these are just feeding huts. And that's because they have entrances under the water. So once the ice is on, they can swim under the ice, enter under the ice, and the whole hut stays open, so they can get in, get up out of the water into the hut, and feed on food without being susceptible to predation. Because everything likes to eat a muskrat, whether it's coyotes, bobcats, on down to mink and otter, but then also the birds of prey. They'll pluck them off like a fuzzy little chicken nugget, like nobody's watching you. So everybody's trying to eat them. They got to hide a lot. Beaver the same way. It's a lot harder for birds of prey to pluck beaver off the water because they weigh a lot more. But pretty much every predator animal that we have here in Illinois, they definitely would like to eat beaver too. This is one of the animals. Obviously, we know wolves, they primarily eat deer, but other than deer, their secondary food source might be beaver. So, really popular prey. Another animal that builds a lot of stuff. Of course, they're famous for the dams. They can engineer their own ecosystems, which can be awesome. That can be great. A lot of wildlife uses those ecosystems, but then, of course, when they do it, that it sort of is at odds with our own manipulation of the natural landscape. Then they can be an issue. So for folks who work on waterfowl areas or anywhere where they try to manipulate the water level using culverts and stuff like that, those folks tend to not like beaver because they cause them a lot of issues. And then, of course, beaver, since they do eat the green bark, the cambium of wood, and they use logs in their construction of whether it be a lodge or a dam, you do find beaver cuttings all over the place. And this can be a major hassle to you if these cuttings happen to be on trees that you planted, ornamentals. They can also be a danger if you're walking through the woods. Imagine if you're wading out there in waders and there's a bunch of water that might be just deeper than the beaver cuttings. Beaver cuttings are always sharp like a punji stick, so it's almost like they're um, tripping hazards out there that you will ruin your day or ruin your weekend, or more than that if you fall on one for sure. So beware of those things out there. And we gotta mention deer because it's mammals, and we're in Illinois. Well, the king of mammals in Illinois is probably the white-tailed deer. We all see them every day, day in and day out. But just because we see them all the time doesn't mean that they're not interesting or there's not cool things that we can learn about their tracks. And um, obviously, I think we all probably know what a deer track looks like, but just remember, sometimes the dew claw shows. People used to say that if you see the dew claw, like in that picture in the right, that always means it's a buck. That's not necessarily true. It's just the heavier the animal is, then the more likely it is to show that dew claw. But this animal in the right is obviously running at about a full trot. That's going to make the toes splay out, make the dew claws contact that soft mud. It doesn't always mean that it's a big buck. It can be a clue that it's a heavier animal, but that's really all it's a clue to. And then just remember, when you do see deer tracks walking, like in the left, they're going towards the narrow end. So that's the direction of travel, because sometimes it can be tough to tell which way they're going with only two toes. Good. Yeah, with that, that's kind of all the meso-sized mammals that you can find in Illinois. And one thing we like to mention in all of our webinars is we like to thank hunters, and how hunters have been leading the way in conservation since at least since 1937, the passing of the Pittman-Robertson Act. And this is an act that really cool, but basically become the funding system for wildlife management and conservation in North America. And it's been an incredible success story. Of course, we had our trials and tribulations before 1937. That was a period of time a lot of people will call the era of extirpation, where people saw no limit to natural resources. There were no regulations, and anything that was scary or impacted people's livelihood, we just killed. And that was unfortunate. But starting in 1937, and around that time, conservation really began to be more of an important thing to American people, and hunters were willing to pay for it. And this act in particular is a 10 to 11% excise tax that's put on firearms, ammunition, and other sporting goods at the retail level, and then goes directly back to the states for habitat conservation, education, things of that nature. So really good. It's an awesome little basically looping system that funds itself. And because of it, now we've got animals like the wild turkey, white-tailed deer, Canada geese, elk, black bears, peregrine falcons, all that have made remarkable recoveries right here in North America at the same time when we're dealing with a ever growing human population and an ever degrading habitat. So it's not all bad news out there. I know there's a lot of rough things going on in the world, but here in North America, we've got some awesome success stories with critters, and we definitely like to remember to sing those praises, and remember that since the advent of regulated hunting and trapping, these activities have never led to a species becoming endangered or extinct, but they have funded a bunch of conservation efforts that have helped animals, whether they be game animals or non-game animals. So really cool system, one we like to talk about. And with that, we will mention just a way to find public land. If you don't have your own spot to go out and look for tracks, you can go to huntillinois.org and go to their hunt planner. And this is a great way to find public land, whether you intend to hunt or not. You can search in a specific area, you can search in a specific county or a region, and find places that you can go out and do things, whether that be hunting, trapping, or just shed hunting, just looking for tracks, or mushroom hunting. About time where morels are going to start popping up. I know some folks down south might already be picking them, but up here in north, we're still shoveling a little bit of snow, but they're not too far off. And with that, we'll open it up to any questions. I want to thank you all for sticking with us today, and hopefully you learned a thing or two about tracks, but more so than that, hopefully you're excited to get out there and look down, because there's a lot of cool things you can see outside. You got to look forward, you got to look up in the trees, you also got to look down, because that's where some of the animals are leaving little clues about what they did all night while you were sleeping and having dreams. They were having a big time out there too, and if you pay attention, you can kind of read the stories they leave behind for us, and it's a good time.
Thanks a lot, Curtis.
Cool. Yeah, not seeing any questions pop up. You guys, everybody's probably eating lunch. I'm about to do the same. Hopefully, everybody enjoyed lunch, and yeah, thanks for joining us today.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Curtis. We'll see everybody next time.
Yep. Bye, everybody. See you, Jason.
See you, bud.